So for today, we will have two panelists doing presentations on soft power and Cold War in Asia. Okay, so for the first presentation, we will have Veronica Sison um, from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. The second one from Jingjing from Peking University. So my name is Ruepert Jiel. I'm a PhD student here at Hong Kong Baptist University at the School of Communication and Film. So it's nice to meet our presenters for today. So I'll begin by introducing um, Veronica. So Veronica is a teaching associate at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, where she is currently taking her MA in history. Her research interests are in Cold War politics and production of knowledge in Southeast Asia, colonial history, and global history. She is taking part in the reconceptualizing the Cold War project spearheaded by Professor Masuda Hajimu of the National University of Singapore. Her presentation is entitled Sukarno, Experiment with Liberal Democracy and the Cornell's Modern Indonesia Project. Our second speaker is Jingjing, a PhD student at the School of International Studies of Peking University, majoring in diplomacy. Her research interest mainly focuses on America's cultural diplomacy and interdisciplinary field in arts and international relations. In 2020, she participated in Peking University and Tokyo University's forum themed The Growing US-China Conflict and South and East Asia. She is now conducting a research on American abstract art and its globalization on a basis of international relations study, and has recently published a critique on internationalization of American contemporary art of China's leading art website, Artron. And with me today is Dr. Mateja Kovacic, who is also with the Academy of Film at Hong Kong Baptist University. So shall we go first with Veronica? And then afterwards, let's proceed with Claudia's presentation. Okay, so Veronica.
Thank you for the introduction. Well, I will share my screen first. There you go. So 11:39. I timed myself 15 minutes. Okay. So good morning, everyone. There's a change in my title, although it's still the same. I still want to emphasize these three topics here: the nascent years of area studies under Sukarno's experiment with liberal democracy, and Cornell Modern Indonesia Project. And Smail's autonomous history. So here in this slide, you will see these people who were crucial contributors in the making of area studies. Of course, it happened during the time of Cold War politics in Southeast Asia. So anyways, since the early independence period of Indonesia, the country has attracted foreign social science and humanities researchers, usually based in colonial metropoles. So in the early 60s, the Cornell Modern Indonesia Project, or otherwise known as CMIP, spearheaded by a renowned activist and scholar George Kahin, produced monumental works in understanding Indonesian politics, religion, and society. So at that time, the US had yet to grapple with the complexities of Asian countries. For example, Southeast Asia, which had undergone long centuries of colonialism and were now transitioning into independent countries. So the immediate concerns for most Western policymakers were Vietnam and Japan, but Indonesia's variations of nationalism and the country's romance with Islam and communism, most especially under the charismatic president Sukarno, attracted scholars. So my research question dwells on the idea that the existing literature has discussed how scholars affiliated with Cornell influenced the trajectory of Indonesian studies. It has not, however, discussed how Sukarno influenced the trajectory of Cornell Modern Indonesia's project's early phase. So this paper will analyze how Sukarno's political career conversed with the CMIP's projects. And this paper is a preliminary work on Sukarno's experiment with liberal democracy. It will limit itself to highlighting Sukarno's collaborative conversation with the Cornell scholars examining both the politics and history of Indonesia. I will outline my research on politics and the historiographical implications of Smail's autonomous history. And I will read these trusts alongside Sukarno's vision of Indonesia within the backdrop of the post-war Cold War Southeast Asian politics. So from here, I would like to divide the discussion of my paper into three parts. First, the post-war mapping of Indonesian studies from the three dominant perspectives coming from the outsiders. I won't discuss the state of Indonesian studies in Indonesia, though it quite intersected with these three camps, the KTLV, otherwise known as the Amsterdam or the Leiden School, the Japanese scholars who kind of documented Southeast Asia during the Second World War, and of course, Cornell. So second part of my paper, I will discuss their collaborative conversation that happened between Sukarno and the Cornell people, and how the Cornell people responded to Sukarno. So the third part is to narrow down on the famous text of John Smail in trying to understand a period in Indonesian history where the autonomous history emerged. So prior to the US version of area studies, there are two camps, of course, that serve as dominant frames in understanding the country. First is the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, which was established in 1851, almost 100 years before the Cornell. Although the Amsterdam Leiden School was mainly influenced by its colonial underpinnings, it served as a foundation for Indonesian studies abroad, and from which the Cornell Modern Indonesia project took off. So Cornell Modern Indonesia project both criticized and contributed to the Amsterdam and Leiden School, and vice versa. And there's the generation of Japanese scholars, which was strongly tied with Pan-Asianist ideology and their imperial objectives during the Second World War. These two camps are important in analyzing post-war Indonesia. But since my focus is on the Cornell Modern Indonesia project, I will narrow down my discussion on how it became a dominant camp in shaping the Indonesian studies. So first, of course, we will start with this very influential figure, George Cahin, an American scholar who had just finished his dissertation entitled Nationalism and Revolution in Indonesia when he was recruited by Cornell. So according to Benedict Anderson, Cahin was, quote, a crucial recruit to Cornell because he was a political scientist at the time when US interest in Southeast Asia was political, unquote. So during his stay in Indonesia, he already formed friendships with nationalists, including Sukarno and communists alike. So his extensive knowledge in the country made him the most sought and qualified scholar to lead the CMIP. So in 1954, through the funding of Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, the Cornell Modern Indonesia project was born. And since CMIP was American-sponsored, Cahin made sure to meet with Indonesian scholars and intellectuals, including Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, who were then the president, vice president of Indonesia, post-war Indonesia, to show his good intention and to avoid suspicions from Indonesian authorities that the project was generating information for the CIA. So upon consultation, Sukarno encouraged Cahin to prioritize topics that would highlight democratic reforms, since there was, quote, the need to cover all major ideologies operating on the Indonesian political scene and all the major political parties, unquote. So Cahin's recruitment of local Indonesian scholars like Sojamoko, Cornell folks such as Herbert Fate, Daniel Lev, Harry Benda, John Smail, Benedict Anderson, and Ruth McVeigh, etc., into the CMIP would fulfill Sukarno's suggestion. So these scholars eventually produced canonical works on the political processes, transformation, and histories of Indonesia's major ideologies and parties at that time. So what could have attracted them to study Indonesia? So for Benedict Anderson, Cahin's new recruits, including him, were generally interested in the dynamic post-war Indonesia and its Communist Party as one of the largest left organizations outside Russia. And of course, the funding and opportunities available and provided by the American institution to understand Southeast Asia at that time, which happened to also navigate, which also happened to be their path on how they navigate their career throughout their years in the academe. So how did Sukarno converse with the CMIP? First, during his experiment with liberal democracy. So the CMIP happened to start its early phase, the early phase of their project in 1954, when Sukarno declared that he wanted to explore these concepts. So the CMIP, along with the University of Indonesia, jointly funded and supported its Institute of Economic and Social Research and Faculty of Law. Both projects touch several topics concerning the contemporary social and political problems of Indonesia, such as trade unions, autonomy, legal institutions, transportation, taxation, etc. So the research outcomes became instrumental in understanding the ground condition in which the quote-unquote democratic participation was taking place in Indonesia's recent experience on ballot election, Sukarno's effort to nationalize state enterprises, and also the rise of new actors competing for power that was emptied when the Japanese left Indonesia and also when the Dutch provided the independence. So second, Sukarno's growing uneasiness and dissatisfaction with liberal democracy was also documented by Herbert Fate in 1962 in his Decline of Constitutional Democracy. So Fate had been exposed in his 2 years of field work in Indonesia on the Parliamentary and Constituent Assembly elections of 1955 and 1956. So in his work, Fate analyzed the political context in which Sukarno's political survivability did not rest on ideological unity. It was no secret that Sukarno despised liberal democracy. Here, Harry Benda's classic assessment resonates with his view that why would Indonesians be enthusiastic about democracy when it was never part of their cultural repertoire? It was then, of course, became a debatable topic among several historians after that. So by the time that nationalism was a dominant frame of analysis during this period, Fate was able to examine the agents of this political crisis, which apparently developed into authoritarianism in 1957's Sukarno's proclamation of guided democracy. So after Sukarno's implementation, similar themes emerged, such as Daniel Lev's publication entitled The Transition to Guided Democracy, Indonesian Politics, 1957 to 1959. By the time Sukarno was facing these regional uprisings, a research on decentralization and regional autonomy was prioritized by the Cornell Modern Indonesia Project fellows, such as Professor John Legg and Gerald Marianov. So another event that followed was Sukarno's invasion of West Papua, or otherwise known as West Irian. So it was a move which was met with, of course, the US increased counterinsurgency operations backing the conservative regional politicians and warlords to oust Sukarno. So Kahin, with his intention to enlighten American policymakers about the situation, encouraged both the State Department and Pentagon to send promising officers destined to serve Southeast Asia to study in Cornell for a year or two. So the publication that followed highlights Sukarno's political maneuver between big powers. Throughout the decades, Sukarno set the agenda for these researches to happen. So there are limitations to the CMIP's analysis, as admitted by Kahin. It was too Java-centric, and given the years allotted to analyze democratic participation, they were not able to predict the military's rise to power. So while their project welcomed a mixed perspective on democracy and nationalism, the trajectory of Indonesian studies would soon change with the rise of a new military leader, which is Suharto. So these waves of researchers published around that time, and these ideas in the minds of Western scholars did not occur in vacuum. Sukarno set the agenda for their research. His ideological syncretism also made collaboration possible for various sectors with ideological differences. It allowed the CMIP to document the great diversity of ideologies and religions participating in a liberal democratic setting, and to show that these phenomena were not uniquely happening in Indonesia, which made it possible for them to also conduct comparative studies abroad. So now we will go into Smale and the national historiography under Sukarno. Smale was, for me, one of the remarkable historians that influenced the trajectory of Southeast Asian studies during this period. And apparently, he was the first student to actually take his PhD under the Cornell Modern Indonesia project. So unlike other works that openly converse with Sukarno's policies like Herbert Fate and Daniel Lev, Smale is a little toned down, so toned down politically. However, if we are to frame Smale's work, it did become antithesis to Sukarno's larger nationalist rhetoric and Java-centric nationalism. Smale challenged the dominant perspective in Indonesian historical imagining, starting from his dissertation, Bandung and Revolution. So eventful and heroic histories became a priority of Sukarno's administration and Ministry of Education. Sukarno and fellow revolutionaries wanted a unifying symbol of a nation's origin, a single indigenous heritage anchored in the kingdom of Majapahit or on the heroic exploits of who could be considered Indonesian, emphasized in the state ideology Pancasila. So that differences could be zeroed out by equal rights and representation. Here, Smale wanted to decenter this narrative and explore the different degrees of colonial interaction, processes and transformation with societies outside Java, which counterbalance nationalist or Eurocentric histories. So both approaches had their critiques. Sukarno's romanticization of history became a strong ideological tool for him to mobilize the people during the time when he was increasingly frustrated by regional uprisings. Sukarno's nationalists were conscious that regional narratives might give credence to national autonomies when people all over the archipelago were urged to become Indonesians first. So on the other hand, Smale only attracted historians of Western orientation and a handful of Indonesian historians who were affiliated with either US and Australia. So despite Sukarno's active use of history to justify his nation-building project, in 1957, the Indonesian government actually had yet to produce a new national history of their country. So school textbooks were still based on the work of Sanusi Paine or Pane produced during the Japanese occupation. So the CMIP saw this opportunity and funded Sochamoko's project entitled Introduction to his Indonesian Historiography, which was co-edited with Gahin. So this was published in 1965 when Sochamoko's scientific history approach was not accepted among the circles of nationalists, including Sukarno. So Smale and Sochamoko's works did not have the intended impact in the succeeding years. Their egalitarian approach did not suit Sukarno's aim to instill loyalty, personal identification, and attachment of Indonesians for their country. While Van Leer, Smale, and Sochamoco were advancing scientific-based history and therefore giving priority to truth and ideology, it was what was romantic Sukarno least needed at that time. So in conclusion, Sukarno was not just a subject to be studied, he was an agent whose ideas formed the other half of the conversation that the Cornell Modern Indonesia project engaged in. Sukarno's Indonesia influenced a larger analysis of nationalism for Benedict Anderson, and also the discourse of historiography for Smale. So the course of Sukarno's political career and his ideas about Indonesia in the context of global affairs and the outcome of CMIP projects created possibilities in which Indonesian studies under area studies is therefore not limited and isolated in the course of global events. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Veronica, for your really interesting and very nuanced presentation. Now let's proceed with the presentation by Claudia Jingjing, entitled Cost Analysis of Promotion of Abstract Expressionism on Foreign Policy of the United States. So Claudia, please.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And it's my privilege to be here and sharing some of my thoughts on this topic. And because there are just two of us, so maybe I will exceed a little bit of time limits, but it's a really interesting topic. And the theme is the cost analysis of promotion of expressionism on foreign policy of the United States. And before that, I will share my screen for all of you guys because there are some pictures and conclusions and summaries of that. All right, so So can you guys hear which slides is I'm showing on? So actually, because I am a PhD candidate at Peking University, and my major is in international relations and diplomacy, but I'm also interested in the study of art history, especially those contemporary art American style. And for me, its majority is of the study of the expressionism. And because in the 3 days conference, and we can see that many scholars have is circulating around topics relating to expressionism, from professors to young scholars on like the original studies of the outward promotion and interpretation of the expressionism, and what are the effects of this promotion. And for me, I think it's really an intriguing and inspiring perspective on the Americans' foreign policy in the Cold War. So that's why I chose this topic. And you know that studies of the cultural Cold War and the promotion of the abstract expressionism have always been like a focus in fields of art history, international relations, and related academic sectors. And currently, it is yet valuable to rewind and dig into the historical period for ulterior enlightenment, just casting a light on the contemporary context. But theoretically speaking, you know, there's deeper and thorough researches in history and causes of the promotion of the abstract expressionism, as well as the mechanism backstage in that era can, to a large extent, prompt and enrich theoretical studies in cultural Cold War and its cultural impact. As far as reality and practice concerned, research on this movement is able to have a better command of the roots of America's outward and even global promotion of art and culture, together with its strategy in elevating its influence in contemporary world. So as you can see in the next slides, and there are 5 parts of my presentation. For the literature review, we have introduced background of this movement and the foreign policy. And the second goes to the history of America's promotion of abstract expressionism. Let's see the historical sites and analysis of America's foreign policy in the Cold War just come along after part 2. And before ending, I like to part something like the mutual effect or interaction of the abstract expressionism and foreign policy in the Cold War, and later just we can draw a conclusion and reflect on maybe on the contemporary context of the contemporary art world. So as you can see that all at its triumph is long gone. It's by Clark T.J. in his book In Defense of Abstract Expressionism. And I think that description is quite precise. It's like abstract expressionism is like a laughter as a chief philosophy, or something that is a distaste, or for its heavy breathing or boredom with its sublimity, or just resentment at the part it played in the Cold War, right? So ever since, like, if we date the history back to Hegel, is he put the basic proposition of modernism into words in the late 1820s or so, and that art, considered to be in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. So art's being actually able, in its sense, to continue as dependent on its success in making that dictum specific and punctual. So if you're familiar with the abstract expressionism and those artworks, the style and traits of them is actually generally interrogated on the basis of the absorption of abstract art and surreal art. So expecting history of art, you can see the abstract art it's like a turning, it's a time and recent development of the exploration and experiment of modern art in Europe, like in the realms such as the featuring abstract and spiritual styles and patterns. And it's also an open up in visual arts, like ushering a novel and authentic American art movement. But in comparison with those costs of foreign policy, more researches, like, they center on aesthetics and traditional, like, rational characters. And we can see, like, for example, in this field, like Dora Ashton, his examination of the artistic movement and his political studies of background aesthetics. And second goes to Irvin Sandler's collection of the publications and his political and studies of background aesthetics, and also like the reports of their art proposals, etc. So if closely examine it in the length of time, the period between 1947 and 1960 witnesses the first wave of the most intense and acute confrontation here after the start of the Cold War, when abstract expressionism arose in twists and turns as an art movement by the states, initially recognized by the domestic market and later entered the international domain, just gaining increasing reputation and dominant positions. However, it was worthy of attention that American government didn't pay much attention to the advantage and potentiality of the abstract expressionism as a strong weaponry, the first stage, right? Its very first phase is just not. So whereas it was boycotted by the conservatives in states in some situations. though the rise of the artistic movement overlapped the timeline of the first acutely battled period of both sides in the Cold War. Well, right after the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1950s, the support of the rapid all-round development of American abstract expressionism at the Department of State and relevant organizations were ensured, which represented a fashionable trait of anti-communism to like in ideology and suddenly the emergence, something like that. But in terms of this point, many scholars just have analyzed the topic of causes and motive for United States in other senses to promote the abstract expressionism in issues correlating in cultural Cold War. But my work just mainly studies America's support and promotion of the abstract expressionism from the perspective of foreign policy and outer promotion, which, like you specifically, lies in analysis of strong and free ideology and American spirits, especially. And this can be concluded from a wide array of artworks of abstract expressionism. Some of that I show here is like assertion American ideology guided by America's internationalism, oriented foreign policy in Cold War, matched perfectly to the characteristics of the artworks as a basis for its usage and values and being exploited by the CIA and officials. So on the basis of the literature review, we have made a slight tour. The study of the cultural Cold War, as well as researches of cultural diplomacy, is necessary as a manner of deeply construing the context of promotion of the abstract expressionism in the very period. You can see like the term cultural Cold War was actually raised by Francis Stoner Sanders, but it's not clearly defined then. So accordingly, questions including America's motive for launching the cultural Cold War, the process of the implementation of the cultural Cold War and its historical impact, and also the relative significance have always been hidden topics, as I mentioned. But besides, it's necessary to comb America's cultural diplomacy and the politics in addition to understand its relations with this promotion. So as we can see, it's a chronicle event in U.S. cultural diplomacy because it's so detailed, so just briefly introduce it. So the government of the United States held that this was necessary to organize in all aspects the charging institutions of international information, culture, and education exchange program, and countering the peaceful offense of USSR, just in America to build the world's people's confidence in America's resolution in maintaining peace and the capacity to lead the world in confronting the challenge of the Soviets and culture, cyclone politics. And you can see that in 1953, President Eisenhower announced the establishment of the Committee of National Information Agents activities, later United States Information Agency, which was independent from the Department of State. And this act rendered the cultural diplomacy of the United States into the realm of the Cold War. And also you can see that John Kennedy, just elected in 1960, took the accuses of national security and endorsed a few significant measures to strengthen the functioning cultural defense of the cultural diplomacy, including the improvement of the laws making of the education and cultures exchanges, and hosting management of the government, as well as the establishment of Peace Corps. So the measures effectively elevated the domain leverage of the government in cultural diplomacy and his control of the executive agency of the cultural diplomacy. There we can see like President Carter even made the best of the approach of cultural diplomacy to promote human rights diplomacy. And then we can see Reagan, because he had no fear of unveiling his hatred towards communism and deemed the role of cultural diplomacy as a weapon of the Cold War. So even though subsequently the Bush administration didn't organize the actuators of cultural diplomacy, but Henry Cato is the Director General of the United States Information Agency, is appointed by Bush. It just had tried out to reshape the image of the agency in the domain of Ronald Reagan. And in analysis of George Herbert Walker Bush, adjustment of emphasis of cultural diplomacy mainly relied on the protection of the fruits of the victory of the Cold War, in a sense. So all in all, in promotion of the artwork classified abstract expressionism is the role of Central Intelligence Agency and the Congress of Cultural Freedom, apart from all these foreign policies, tools, is of utmost significance as well. So before this part to come to an end, I like to say that the phenomenon of CIA-ing American diplomacy can not only be detected in the Cold War, just ending up increasing difficulty of foreseeing America's foreign policy, and the problem has arisen presently. So generally speaking, there are rarely case studies in researching the cause for information of America's policy and tactics and cultural Cold War with light shedding on the foreign policy in academic debate. So my research questions for this paper comes to the cause analysis of America's promotion of this movement is quite we have some new and novel perspectives to it. So let's go to the history of America's promotion of Expressionism for a while. As you can see, the brilliant works of those famous painters, this movement is artistic movement. It's first sprung up in the United States, which developed in New York in the 1940s and later prospered in the 1950s, and finally went to decline in the 60s. So it's rather not that long, but abstract artists had no universal style in common, and the feature did not have like unparalleled pursuit and creed in showing and delivering messages in art, just containing the inner passion of the artist, diversely individual experiences for the outburst of livelihood of the art per se. So you can see that a quote from an artist describes some reputable words. It represents a triumph of art over factitious vulgarity, yet because the picture is so clearly an act wheel in the field of artifice, the victory seems perfect. So it's beyond doubt that the bloom and rise at the very moment and like closely related to the trace and charm of the art itself on the one hand, but I want to emphasize it. On the other hand, the impetus of ideology and politics that serve a rather core and crucial essential role in this case. Among them, what I mentioned, the CIA was one of the key departments in the States, even directly ruled by the presidents in politics, which urged the promotion under crappy schemes in some cases. And the time the abstract expressionism was springing up, the CIA and the CCF already knocked that artistic movement and its huge potentiality in spreading artistic influence on American culture and value. In the 1970s, with essential cultural intrusion invasion of the third world by the CCF, the so-called, and the abstract expressionism and the representative artworks enjoyed a unprecedented artist impact all over the world alongside numerous important exhibits. So when we try to recall the historical context, the taste in the United States, McCarthyism, it cannot be ignored. It's like his historical attack on the non-mainstream had all trapped the government in a totally embarrassing dilemma. In 1946, you can see that Advanced American Art, this activity is organized by newly established Office of International Information Cultural Affairs by the U.S. government. So the exhibit was, however, bitterly blamed by the American Professional League of Art and claiming that artwork chosen were just filled with tense radicalism embedded in European art and were not really national culture. And a few of the artists even in the community, so Marshall just canceled the exhibit and ordered that money by taxpayer couldn't be used on modern art anymore. And back then it was really difficult for the United States to strengthen the cultural supremacy, though the power was nearly completely shifted from Paris to New York since 1930s. And that was rightly what the CIA could make up for and step in. Like they wanted to just launch a cultural cold war against the USSR. And as you can see, it's a picture from the CCF Second Conference in Berlin. So when we judge in the artwork in political sense, and artwork is not a unified whole, especially in that era, but rather than open-ended sites of contestation wherein cultural practices from different classes and ethnic groups are temporarily combined. So like Nicholas Nabokov, he instantly planned the following acts at the Africa exhibit themed Young Painters in 1955 to 1965, which was a great example showing that some other notable members of the CCF Museum of Modern Art and participated in this and relentlessly and firmly with agreements of both sides to promote these activities. And you can see that merely the Museum of Modern Art hold over 33 international exhibitions to advertise abstract expressionism from 1952 to 59 to a group of major European cities. And economically, the CIA had spent over millions and millions of dollars in the CCF from 1950 to 1967, they're all funded by Marshall Plan with cooperation of Fluxo Foundation. So there was no doubt the secret campaign was in the name of liberty, but in fact, a cultural crusade with God to be a means of carrying out the national policy. And one of the main goals of the Cold War strategy of the United States was challenging the base of neutralism. However, now it had been changed into the official approach of the Congress. So with so many evidences that back of the former officials is supporting abstract expressionism facilitated art makers' political censorship, so it could be proved that the CCF actually provided platforms for the critiques of the abstract painters, also like as sponsors for these exhibitions. And it's also true that many artists even knew nothing about that, acts were covered, but this also brought convenience for CIA members to employ this, considering themselves to be a right to be close to Moscow instead of Washington, and that is the so-called Long Bell policy. And to it, coincidentally, you can see that George Kennan even consented to the idea of free art as well. So After all this, let's analyze America's foreign policy in the Cold War and how it's related to the promotion of the abstract expressionism. And as you can see, like historical events is February 1947, the born of the long telegram by George Kennan and X article, the rise of the policy of containment is quite important, but we should be noted that the moment it was raised, the US government had not reached consensus on the approaches and range of those containment. And while George Kennan just inclined to contain with emphasis that economy and politics instead of the thing that he initially raised. But event of the Korean War urged the government to have the same stand of total containment of USSR immediately. So shortly afterward, policy of containment improvised was served as a core global strategy of the United States with the goal of battling the Soviets, containing the expansion of the communism over the 40 years. So actually, the proposal and implementation of policy containment was a critical turning point of America's foreign policy. Why is that? Because it certified that its national security policy just transiting from regional policy to global policy, with the old idea of exterior expansion changed into global expansion. And what we can see that no matter it was Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, or the Bush administration, all sorts of contention, their diplomacy were run through by ideology on the containment. And in the Cold War, the infiltration of internationalist-oriented foreign policy in the field of art can be seen exactly as strengthening America's status in art and culture. The United States, from the top to the bottom, from the civil to the government, have all made unremitting endeavors in fighting for the victory of the cultural Cold War. So these issues, and there are also critiques and comments that, that organ that truly control the political rights of the United States, maybe the deep states, and part of the elites have close relationship to the rising Democratic Party by then, and they were considered to be responsible for the left-leaning approach, which directly affected foreign policy and a shift in the steering wheel of the United States in Cold War. So apart from that, decision-making and the process of the foreign policy making of the United States also determined the implementation of the foreign policy and the shift in inclination. So, and in it, we can see in the circle, the president even lays the core in decision-making. So soon after the Second World War, the United States has a strong sense of anxiety and insecurity in the fight against the USSR to a great extent, and anxiety and the fear just penetrated Cold War. But she's not really proficient at setting all the images of simulated enemies after the war. And the reason for that mainly goes down to the intention of strengthening security measures of the United States so as to surpass and contain the foes in the capacity of the military weapon. So that is to say, in the cultural field, America's foreign policy had created much space for the cultural NATO due to the worry of its own security from the cover front, which applied the same to numerous left-leaning organizations and foundations. So for a long time, religious speaking, this Calvinism has huge impact on American political thoughts and ideology. What it asserts is regarding Americans like the redeemers and savers of the world. And coincidentally, when the aesthetics of abstract expressionism or abstract artists presume that, okay, there is true self in their works and true self in their transcendental meanings, which could effectively distinguish and express noumenon fluently. So on physical perspective, or philosophical perspective, it means that they had gone so far in the chase of genuine presence of absolute noumenon, a kind of ontology that was actually endopic per se. So all these knit a close relations to American spirits, and here just mentality as well, with complex constituents of belief and culture tradition. So it is sound to judge the inclination of internationalism and expansionism in the U.S. foreign policy since spiritual core of the art political goal that how they correspond to each other. So let's see. As for the mutual effect, after McCarthyism encountered a really low ebb, people such as elites, intellectuals, the leftists, plus leftists and circular art culture took the upper hand of the decision and worked even harder to promote the movement. In 2001, the foreign policy has affected the United States largely owing to its alternation in the goals, and also thanks to promotion, which can be a reasonable motif for this phenomenon given the perspective of the foreign policy in the Cold War. And that diversity together with attributes of the pursuit of freedom and democracy related to the political context are also well demonstrated by the art and environment of the United States. The rise of abstract expressionism in America has a positive interaction with the development of ideology, interior environment of the United States. So here, diplomacy is the extension of the domestic politics. So America's ideology just urges her to output cultural resources internationally, which shall benefit the diplomatic interest. It was the vivid portrayal of one in profile America's cultural diplomacy, which was specifically defined as namely the Cultural Cold War. And the abstract expressionism was one dynamic constituent of that. So exactly, it was foreign policy carried out by the United States government, especially Department of State, and the overground cooperation with USIA and funds of various kinds is really worked. So those the fact together with American superpower, like supreme power politics worldwide and absolute leverage, coercive role of international system also reinforces the practice of the diplomatic weapon. So at that time, the free art actually is a social role of consolidating capitalism. So it valued for its uselessness and its most important function as a Cold War weapon at one time, leading the avant-garde art into a somewhat predicament. So when we just carefully analyze the post-war foreign policy in the United States, and also there's a criticism on the true buzz of the United States, we had mentioned, but pathetically, it's a U.S. policymaker just sadly overestimated, put by Michael Krantz. It's like overestimate their ability to use art as a weapon in the Cold War, particularly when dealing with modern art and abstract expressionism. Because the joy of aesthetics can be passed on among people, and the art is material that delivers spirits. So it already lost efficacy due to the separation of spirits and materials by philosophy and religion, especially after the Middle Age. So therefore, it would be more difficult for people to regain rightful perception to what is art and what is joy. So not to mention the contradictory political intervention of appreciation of the artworks of various camps under the shadow of propagandism. So the misunderstanding and battles of minds deteriorate and damage the pure aesthetics of the artworks movement in confrontation with the joint force of the art and part of the politics, deliberately and self-complacent. So quickly drawing to an end in my conclusion reflection in my paper, when we begin to reflect America's full support and promotion of artworks, it's easy to find out that this act is helpful in the elevation of America's cultural artists influence to dominant and central positions worldwide. However, it has many negative impact on development of the abstract art if the foreign policy and politics are concerned, because the abstract expressionism had descended into a political weapon and tool, even though it had certain avant-garde aesthetic characteristics. But, the paradoxical connection between American art world and the government has influenced the result of those outward advertisement and movements. And the members of those American art world have to some extent have unrealistic antipathy to government control over its cultural affairs, and they were tempered by that thoughts in some cases, and it's really it's not that okay. And as for the relations between the art value and propaganda stratagem, the author partly agreed with the point of view that the art needed to be considered within a specific context in order for its propaganda value to be most successfully achieved, and that to which I almost agree. So in the light correlating documents, Department of State and USIA, they worked closely together, establishing the idea from 1950s to the early 1960s. This art became a mirror of the Cold War world. But as ironic as US officials found out that the art actually is held up as an exemplary of the US spirit, suddenly change our identities into something like the tools to spare upbeat tone of American impression or imperialism. So frankly speaking, apart from the department officials and the leftists, members of the American art world, we're not entirely innocent in the failure of intentional art program. And you can see some cases like the down of the attempts like advancing American art. Somebody just described it as the fell prey to rescue policy to change the proposals represented by Alfred Barr, because it's a total failure in their eyes. But these acts may have inadvertently killed the original intentions for the art in the international realm. And also the international art program providing neither an ideological fellow shelter for American propagandists nor an avenue for speaking to the human spirit, so desire of American art lovers. So in some cases, some critics just argue that it's a total failure. But according to the fact of promotion, demonizing the abstract aesthetics and the rivalry of the realism aesthetic both sides led profound impact on cultural exchanges and education of art during the Cold War and contemporary era. And that's one point I'm just persisting reflecting on. The naming the cultural Cold War in the field of abstract expressionism and socialist realism is a triumph of the art. part or just a win of the United States. I just would rather term it like in a condition of foreign policy intervened effort. It's not what the movement wanted to prove or achieve. So totally, I think that there's no winner in the field of art. And the problems are unavoidably intertwined with politics and aesthetics. And you can see that is quoted from the three philosophers, Agamben, Kant, and Deleuze, their explanation of perception and reckons like the late potential emergence in the rupture of it, the so-called critical theory. So in contrast to the extreme, both the Cold War aesthetics of the free art superiority over the socialist art by the United States, many conservative civilians kept rather sensible aesthetics towards the dazzling grand exhibits around the corner. So I would persist that principle of prudence shall be adhere to the shift of the transcendence experience in perceptions, like from the abstract philosophical epistemology to definite social ethical issues, particularly in the new century. So for my conclusion part is like when we are cautiously judging reality and we see those people appreciating the contemporary art world, especially abstract style sent by the American and European countries to the third world, this kind of appreciation has something to do with the leftover toxins of the kind of confrontation in aesthetic politics. So, I mean, the stereotypes of the Cold War confrontation is yet deteriorating current international art market, like with the rudimental toxins that I mentioned, like left over before the 1990s. And for me, I think that there's no clear sign of like for us, for humans to stride over the trap like in the coming future. So maybe I think that conclusion is just on behalf of my own ideas, but I just welcome and welcome those different opinions to join me, and we have discussion later, because I think it's really maybe a controversial theme, but I think it's really worthy of discussions deeply. And all right, thank you very much. And this is my presentation of my cost analysis of promotion of abstract expressionism, especially on the perspective of the foreign policy. And this is my email, and hope that maybe you guys who are interested in this field, especially interdisciplinary study of art history and international relations, we can work further on this topic, and is expecting the heated discussions later. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Claudia, for your presentation. So I would like to offer a short synthesis of the two presentations. So what strikes me in Veronica's presentation is how Indonesia's history and politics, when Indonesia is trying to find its national identity, is shaped immediately by international relations. So reeling straight from World War II and earlier years of decolonization. Unabated negotiations with foreign powers using soft power, but also economic negotiations and sanctions, compel former colonies to lend themselves well into Cold War politics. And expansion of superpowers' global ideological and economic interests and ambitions. The cultural Cold War still rages on today, and academic programs, human rights concerns, research initiatives, and cultural diplomacy are still used in the negotiation of ideology on a global scale. For example, films are becoming more and more important component in China's global charm offensive. Meanwhile, other forms of diplomacies that Claudia discussed, such as human rights diplomacy, coexist in today's cultural Cold War. Supranational organizations, regional blocs, and Western superpowers are very much interested in cultural, economic, diplomatic, and political adherence to human rights. To tie these trends, soft power is exercised along the different fronts of culture, arts, knowledge production, economy, and politics. While the paper presented today discuss the different diplomacies and negotiations in the context of the first Cold War, which coincided with the infancy stages of decolonization. Our brilliant presenters today also invite us to think of how these logics and negotiations survive as we live right in the middle of a new Cold War. So I want to take this opportunity to ask the first question. So, for Claudia, um, what strikes me in your presentation is there are some, I think, parallels of Sukarno's politics that are surviving today, especially in the Philippines. Um, um, so my question is, are there parallel developments and trajectories of these policies in Southeast Asian countries? Seems to me that Sukarno's nationalistic slant and courtship with, with U.S. and its own, assertion of national identities in the First Cold War is happening today. Like for example, in China, in Duterte's regime, that seems to dance between U.S. and Chinese politics. And then my question to Claudia is, because you talked about the role of art, abstract expressionism in U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War era. I wanted to ask if there are some comparable strategies of using art or cultural forms on the part of USSR and its allies. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. But I would like to pardon some so your question is for America to exploit the weaponry of abstract art and expressionism, like his cultural diplomacy in the realm of this cultural Cold War. So you think so you want to ask me like the relationship between the America's national movement and its cooperation with its allies or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes, but I was asking if there were parallel developments of using culture in say the USSR side. In short, if USSR also used the same, cultural forms to advance its own ideologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I got it. And thank you. I think it's really inspiring questions. And you know what? I'm just also making some researches on like the America's organizations in art and culture to the Soviets, and maybe some differences between the Russia's or the Soviets, the former USSR, the Soviets' influence on the culture and art. Well, for the USSR, because of socialist realism, and you can have a close look at their artworks. The propagandization in Soviets are not that strongly appealed in America's spiritual elevation of their artworks, because in my researches, I've mentioned that there are some factors that influencing America's cultural diplomacy, and especially you were saying namely the cultural Cold War to be launched if we just had a consensus on the ground that on the Americas and Soviets competition, and that is United States, who has firstly and voluntarily raised the cultural campaign towards those socialist countries. So for America, the special point is their belief, their traditions, their cultures, and especially their cooperation and interrelating connections between the domestic art market and outward implementation of those our foreign policies have really knitted together and live closely to each other. So it's a little bit different from the USSR's policy in propaganda. But let us not say that the USSR was not doing good, but I think that it's in different arenas and profile of this elevation of their foreign policy. But for me, what is more interesting, and I think that your questions are quite inspiring, and I thought of something else, and maybe after 1970s, the downward of the movement of expressionism, and also the CCF, because it's now altering to another organizations, and so-called cultural NATO was not operating or functioning like that much before 1970s. So I think maybe it's a really more important issue to be discussed here. Like, why did the systems or the institutions or the mechanisms set up by the cultural diplomacy of the United States, had just undergone another turning point in 1970s? And it's like a sudden, it's not a clash, but actually is a going downhill. And some motive for that maybe are more worthy of discussion here. So maybe I just will work some of it, and later I'll have comparison with the motives that is, especially in perspective of foreign policy in 1950s, to compare it with the promotion of the expressionism. And I think that maybe we can find a lot about the answers of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudia. Veronica?
Yeah, thank you for that terrific question. So you're asking about the parallelism of these like soft power policies in Sukarno and then in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, okay, thank you. Basically, the original version of my paper is in the Philippines, and it's just my advisor wanted me to focus on Indonesia this time. So yes, there are extreme parallels, but also I think Philippines is at least on the advantage of being more documented in this period, because we were basically like allies with the United States in trying to explore and also import ideas during the Cold War, similar to Claudia's account about cultural diplomacy. In the Philippines, it also happened in the form of like Cold War production of knowledge in terms of public governance, the creation of UP-NCPAG, trying to create a bastion for like, okay, we can't fall into communism, we have to promote public governance. And that's how they wanted to like portray democracy, in a sense that, okay, it involves electoral participation. And in the terms of another cultural dimension of this is the UP Ateneo, the Ateneo Institute for Philippine Culture, which is that one, they actually receive a direct funding from the US. I don't know which Rockefeller or these institutions are still very much active in this promotion. But also in terms of historiography, that's the one I am working on my MA thesis, how also Rockefeller and Ford managed to create a new dimension of like a different approach in historiography that goes against the nationalist camps. And they are actually varied. They are in the form of quantitative history, local history, regional histories, and so on. And even the recent published work by Kevin Nadal, about Nick Joaquin and those writers to like create I think it was their generation who were very creative. But then again, part of their fellowships, I guess, is that they have to be very fluent in English, and that has its own neo-colonial orientation at that time. So yeah, there are many ways on how we could see how this Cold War actually manifested in the Philippines during that time, in the early Magsaysay until Marcos period. But it's a very unexplored field in the Philippines because, yeah, we always focus on the colonial history and also let's say the Second World War. Anyways, I hope that answers your inquiry. Though I have a question for Claudia too.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm really interested in that Cold War abstract expressionism, because I thought that it only kind of happened just between US and then USSR. But I'm also wondering, did it actually affect the way Asian artists like converse with their fellow neighbors, or was there like a competition? It was different in China, for example, or in India, or in Singapore, Malaysia. I wanted to know how these networks of abstract expressionist artists talk about this, and of course their affiliation with their ideologies.
All right, thank you, Veronica. And I think that I feel so appreciated for your question, because I think your questions have, for one thing, have prompted and promote my ideas on this level, because, you know, the purpose that I'm just participating in conference, I think that it can provide some platforms and new perspectives on my topic. And I think that because you have raised these questions, and before my answer, I would like to make a complimentary comments on it. It's like when you are thinking on these issues and you want to elaborate these issues and put it furthermore, and then you are just doing it quite good, because these are the questions and issues issues that is worthy of more deeper debates in this field, and many scholars in this field are also working on it. So I think it's really good questions. And for me, I'm not daring to say that I'm a proficient in this field, because now I'm just still working on it, especially from the foreign policy of the United States. This perspective is like, it's not a mainstream actually in the like history of arts studies, and especially the abstract expressionism, as I've mentioned. But for your question, I think there are some evidences that I've gathered recently for, like, you know, the expressions or the delivery of those artworks by the American government and those civil foundations or some organization relating to it. They have really have some great effect, or had some really great effect between like 1950 to 70s, especially like what I've mentioned, the CIA and the CCF. If you look at a documentary released on the website of the United States government and also the CIA's official websites, you can see those documents unveil the truth that like the cover fronts have really made great endeavors in pushing those cultural events or something like that to influence the notable figures in different art worlds. For example, I would say that in China, you know, because, you know, there are not many scholars who are circulating on this topic, but I think that it's really important to study on like America's abstract expressionism, especially their aesthetics and their works of art. How did they influence the Chinese scholars, especially in the works of art, or like painters, sculptors? What did they do and what did they learn from expressionism, and in what situation, in what mechanisms does or did the those museums or foundations in cover front have helped or pushed or elevated the phenomenon to be expressed global wide? So I'm wondering that if you guys have ever familiar with the like the 1985 the art movement in China. You know, it's quite an evidence for these artworks, especially in abstract art, to be like learned and spread in China. And after 1985, there are spread of the flux of artists, their works and features, and especially aesthetics. You can see that the form and shape and even colors of the works have greatly changed into those patterns, really relating to their absorption of the minds, like the influence of or impact of American abstract art work. So I think it's really makes sense in this field. And because like the conference yesterday, and I've heard something from another Indonesian scholar, and not Indonesian, but a Polish scholar. And I think that her research is in the abstract art influence in like Polish and also the Central Europe has made great effect on this topic relating to like the spreading of those art from America to like especially the third world, firstly Europe and then the third world. And I think that those roots or essence of these policy or of these effect may be credited to what I've mentioned is a cause analysis, especially a foreign policy, because it's like a cultural offense. It's like a something we can say that propaganda or something for the art's sake, for the politics sake. We don't know, but it's still controversial. But for me, I think this is the domain of those factors interrelating to each other and intertwined is so sophisticated. So it's really difficult for us to find out just only one point here in one thesis. So we need more like studies in this field and maybe the spreading to different countries and what did they do and what are really the effect and what are the truth of the history. And I think it's really worthy of discussion here. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Victor raised his hand, so yeah, please.
I thank you for your interesting presentations and especially for the chance of developing these specific themes of pictorial art. You know, as early as in 1980, as early as in 1948, yeah, still under Stalin, there was a group by Yuri Belutin who practiced abstract art, and not by himself, but by a group of students whom he taught the methods of doing non-figurative forms of art. It is immature to think that art propaganda and official pictorial art would be chewed and absorbed by all the population. young people want to express themselves, and they don't want to deal anything with official propaganda. They want to see the world with their own eyes, and they can find means of expression that cannot be regulated and controlled by political authorities, be it China or be it Russia or be it any other country. It is true that artists could get government education and get official jobs by being employed by the state. There were 40,000 admitted artists to the Union of Soviet Artists, but there were many more who were not officially recognized, who earned their living by other means, sweeping floors or washing dishes, but at the same time doing art they wanted to do. And if you look at the group of Bilutin, it is interesting to see that they all were in the same flock of abstract surrealism, but they were very intent on doing good abstract art. Not just whatever I want and show it, frame it, and then even a spit, if you frame it well, is a piece of saleable art. They did other things. They did real color palette. They tried to combine things to make compositional lines, and they had an idea they wanted to express. So later there were many more such guys, and even the government had to admit their right to exist, though they made a bulldozer exhibition that they swept away the paintings because artists want recognition. And they show it not only in their flats, but they showed it inviting foreign correspondents and the public to show that there is avant-garde art existing in this way. And the Bilutin group was cracked on in 1962 when the official dons of the Soviet painting art made a huge exhibition dedicated to the 3 decades of Moscow Union of Artists. And they invited the abstractionists, and they specially showed them to Khrushchev, who became enraged with this type of art that he couldn't understand and comprehend, and didn't want to comprehend. And there were huge debates on that. But this did not preclude these people to become popular, to be collective, went to Europe, some remained here. But this is a very complex process. So I advise you, if I may say something in terms of advice, to look at the personal intents of individual artists. Because if I'm an artist and I want to express myself, I will do it not because of their ideology, but in contrast to what ideology says. I will do on the opposite what they do, or I will take the third way. I will spit on what is happening on the official line, and I will spit on the popular abstract things and pursue my own work, tacitly and silently. And to find these people is the most interesting thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for the very insightful comments. Well, we don't have much time, but Claudia, do you want to respond to that shortly? No?
All right, thanks. Thanks, Professor. I think that it's really a great compliment to my studies because, you know, in my thesis this time is like just for the foreign policy. And I do know that there's a space for me to have a deep research on like the biography of those artists. What did they think about that? And because in the middle part of my thesis, there's something relating to like some like artists, Barney Newman or other famous painters, they have their political stance in their promotion of the art. So this relationship can say something to, or can respond to what Professor has mentioned, like when we have a close look at what the personalities or what individuals are thinking, and is it like relating to their art or is it not? Or do they know that do the art belong? So that's really tricky. But when we dig deep into that question, we may find something out there. But before the end of this conference might have a question for Veronica. I think that you mentioned you have time.
Claudia, sorry, I have to cut it. Yeah. If you could, maybe you can email Veronica the question. I'm really sorry because we're running out of time. But thank you so much for participating in this really wonderful panel, and we all really learned a lot from the presentation. So thank you very much and have a good morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.